In 1840, a 10-year-old boy stood on an auction block in Rio de Janeiro, sold into slavery by the one person who should have protected him above all others: his own father. Born free, betrayed for gambling debts, stripped of his childhood and his liberty. It was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of human rights. That boy, Luís Gama, would teach himself to read while enslaved, master the law without ever stepping foot in a university, and use the very legal system that bound him in chains to shatter the shackles of over 500 people. He became the lawyer the slaveholders feared most, the poet who mocked their corruption, the voice that couldn't be silenced, all without formal credentials, all despite every barrier a slave society could construct. But here's the question that haunted Brazil's elite and still resonates today. How did someone who couldn't even legally own property, who was denied access to education, who faced death threats for his work, manage to outsmart the most powerful slaveholders and judges in the Brazilian Empire? How did he turn the law itself, the very instrument of his oppression, into a weapon of mass liberation? Stay until the end. The answer will change how you see every limitation you've ever faced. To understand Luís Gama's transformation, we need to start where his story begins, not with his enslavement, but with his mother, Luísa Mahin. But that's not all she was doing. Luísa Mahin was a leader in the underground resistance movement. She was involved in organizing slave uprisings, possibly including the famous Male Revolt of 1835, when Muslim African slaves rose up against their white oppressors in one of the largest urban slave rebellions in the Americas. The Male Revolt wasn't just another slave uprising. It was a sophisticated, organized rebellion that nearly succeeded in overthrowing the white power structure in Salvador. The rebels were educated, literate in Arabic, and had a clear political vision. They planned to attack on the night of January 24, 1835, during a Catholic festival when the white population would be distracted. They wanted to kill all whites and mulattoes, free all enslaved Africans, and establish an Islamic state in Bahia. The revolt was betrayed at the last moment. Someone informed the authorities. The rebels fought anyway. For hours, armed African men battled police and military forces through the streets of Salvador. They fought with courage and discipline. They fought knowing they would probably die, and many did. The government's response was brutal. Hundreds were arrested, many were executed, others were whipped publicly, hundreds of lashes, their bodies broken as a warning to anyone else who might resist. Still, others were deported, sent back to Africa or to other parts of Brazil where they couldn't organize. Luísa Mahin was among those who had to flee. Whether she was directly involved in the Malay Revolt or in other resistance activities, we don't know for certain. But we know she was part of that world. She was part of the network of people who refused to accept slavery as inevitable. And when the crackdown came, she had to run. She was deported to Rio de Janeiro. Some historians believe she was eventually sent even further, possibly back to Africa. What we know for certain is that she never saw her son again. Think about what it meant to be her son. Luís was born on June 21, 1830, in Salvador, born free. His mother had already won her own freedom. She was raising him in a world where he knew, from his earliest memories, that resistance was possible, that freedom could be fought for, that the system wasn't inevitable or natural. It was a choice people made, and it could be unmade. He grew up hearing stories of Africa, of the Nagu people, of resistance, of dignity. His mother wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. And even though he was just a child, he was absorbing those lessons. He was learning that you don't accept injustice, you fight it, even if it costs you everything. But his mother's resistance work made her a target. After the Male Revolt failed, the Brazilian government cracked down hard. They weren't just punishing the rebels, they were trying to destroy the entire network of resistance. Anyone suspected of involvement, anyone who had connections to the African Muslim community, anyone who seemed like a threat, they were all targets. Luísa Mahin had to leave her son behind. She had no choice. If she stayed, she'd be arrested, possibly executed. So she fled. And Luís was left with his father. His father was Portuguese, a man who had come to Brazil seeking fortune and found only debt. He had already squandered his own inheritance. He was drowning in gambling debts. And he looked at his 10-year-old son and saw a solution. Not a child, not a human being, a commodity, something he could sell to pay off what he owed. And then came the betrayal that would define everything. In 1840, when Luís was just 10 years old, his father did the unthinkable. He sold his own son to pay off his debts, not just any sale, an illegal sale, because Luís had been born free. Under Brazilian law, you couldn't enslave someone who had been born free. But his father didn't care about the law. He cared about his gambling debts. So he handed his 10-year-old son over to a slave merchant, and Luís was shipped to Rio de Janeiro. Imagine being 10 years old. Imagine your own father, the person who's supposed to protect you, selling you like property. Imagine the confusion, the terror, the absolute shattering of trust. Luís went from being a free child with a mother who fought for liberation to being enslaved, owned, treated as less than human. The journey to Rio must have been terrifying. He was with a slave merchant, probably traveling with other enslaved people, all of them being transported like cargo. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what would happen to him. He only knew that his father had betrayed him, his mother was gone, and he was alone. He was placed in the home of a Portuguese owner in Rio. We don't know much about this first owner, but we know that later Luís ended up with a man named Cardoso. For 8 years, from age 10 to 18, Luís Gama lived as a household slave. He watched other enslaved people suffer. He felt the daily humiliation of being owned. He carried the knowledge that this was illegal, that he shouldn't be here, but had no power to do anything about it. Household slavery was different from plantation slavery, but it wasn't easier. You were constantly under surveillance. You had to anticipate your owner's needs, their moods, their whims. You had no privacy, no autonomy, no control over your own body or time. You were a possession. And every day reinforced that message. You are not human. You are property. But something was happening inside him during those years. He wasn't just surviving, he was watching, learning, storing up every injustice, every contradiction, every crack in the system. He was his mother's son. He hadn't forgotten her lessons about resistance. He was just waiting for his moment. And then, in 1847, when he was 17 years old, everything changed. A student befriended him. His name was Prado. And Prado did something that would alter the course of Brazilian history. He taught Luís to read and write. We don't know exactly how this friendship developed. Maybe Prado was a guest in the household. Maybe he was a tutor for the owner's children. Maybe he just saw something in this young, enslaved man, some spark of intelligence, some hunger for knowledge. Whatever the reason, Prado took a risk. Teaching enslaved people to read was dangerous. It was often illegal or heavily restricted because slaveholders understood something fundamental. Literacy was power. Think about what literacy meant in a slave society. It was access. It was the ability to understand the very laws that kept you in chains. It was the ability to read newspapers, to understand what was happening in the world, to see that slavery wasn't universal, that other places had abolished it. It was the ability to forge documents, to write passes, to communicate with other enslaved people. Slaveholders knew this. That's why teaching enslaved people to read was often illegal or heavily restricted, because literacy was dangerous. It gave people ideas, it gave them tools. Prado didn't just teach Luís the alphabet, he inspired in him an interest in the law. While serving as a household slave, Luís was learning the language of liberation. He was discovering that the system had rules, and rules could be understood, analyzed, and used. He was learning that the law was full of contradictions, that if you understood those contradictions, you could exploit them. And he was hungry for it. Imagine being 17 years old, enslaved for 7 years, and suddenly discovering that you can read, that you can access knowledge, that you can understand the system that's oppressing you. It must have been like a door opening in a dark room, like suddenly seeing a path forward where before there was only a wall. Within 1 year of learning to read, Luís Gama did something extraordinary. He secretly obtained documents proving that his enslavement was illegal. We don't know exactly how he got them. Maybe he found his birth records. Maybe he tracked down proof of his mother's free status. Maybe he used his newfound literacy to forge documents or to navigate bureaucratic systems. But he got them. And in 1848, at age 18, he escaped from Cardoso's home. But he didn't just run, he used those documents to establish his freedom legally. He proved that he had been illegally enslaved. And then he joined the army. Think about the audacity of that, the strategic brilliance. He didn't just disappear into the shadows. He claimed his freedom through the very legal system that had failed to protect him as a child. He was already learning to fight the system from within. Joining the army was a smart move. It gave him legitimacy, it gave him a salary, it gave him a place in society. He wasn't a runaway slave, he was a free man, a soldier, someone with legal standing. He was building a foundation for everything that would come next. For the next decade, Luís Gama educated himself. He read everything he could get his hands on. He studied law, history, literature, philosophy. He devoured books. He taught himself Latin, which was essential for understanding legal texts. He studied Roman law, which was part of Brazil's legal heritage. He learned about legal systems in other countries. He was building a knowledge base that would rival any formally educated lawyer. But he wasn't just studying for himself. He was teaching others. He taught children to read, passing on the gift that Prado had given him. He understood that education was liberation, that every person who learned to read was one more person who could challenge the system. He was already building a movement, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. By 1859, at age 29, he was already established as an author. He had published his first book of poetry, Primeiras Trovas Burlescas, which means first burlesque ballads. These weren't just poems, they were weapons. Each one was a satirical attack on slavery, on the hypocrisy of Brazilian society, on the pretensions of the elite. He was using humor and mockery to strip away the dignity of the slave system. He was showing that slaveholders weren't noble or respectable. They were ridiculous. They were corrupt. They were morally bankrupt. And he was working as a lawyer for enslaved people, without a law degree, without formal credentials, without any of the institutional backing that lawyers typically had. He was doing it through sheer force of will, intelligence, and an intimate understanding of what it meant to be trapped in that system. Think about what that means. A man who had been enslaved just 11 years earlier was now defending enslaved people in court. He was standing in front of judges and arguing for freedom. He was using the law, the same law that had been used to enslave him, to free others. He was proving that the system could be beaten. In 1869, when he was 39, Luís Gama received a license to practice law in the lower courts. He became what was called a rabula, a semi-professional lawyer. He couldn't get a full law degree. The institutional racism of Brazilian society made sure of that. Universities weren't open to formerly enslaved black men. The doors were closed. The system was designed to keep people like him out. But he didn't need their credentials. He had something more powerful. He had lived experience. He had motivation. And he had a brilliant legal mind. He had spent years studying the law, understanding its contradictions, finding its weaknesses. He knew Brazilian law better than most formally trained lawyers. Because he had to. His life and the lives of the people he was defending depended on it. Gama's legal strategy was revolutionary. He didn't just argue individual cases. He looked for the contradictions, the loopholes, the places where Brazilian law contradicted itself. And there were many. Brazil in the 1860s and 1870s was a society in crisis over slavery. The Atlantic slave trade had been declared illegal in 1850. The law of the free womb was passed in 1871, declaring that children born to enslaved mothers would be free. The country was full of legal ambiguities. Gama exploited every single one of them. He used Roman law principles, which were part of Brazil's legal heritage. He deployed the concept of legal pluralism, arguing that different legal traditions within the Brazilian Empire contradicted each other. In one famous 1874 case, he creatively employed the principle of free soil, arguing that a slave who had been on a ship from a nation that didn't allow slavery should be considered free. Let me give you a specific example of how brilliant his legal arguments were. In one case, he represented an enslaved person who had been brought to Brazil on a ship that had stopped in a country where slavery was illegal. Gama argued that the moment that person set foot on free soil, even temporarily, they became free. And Brazilian law had to recognize that freedom. The judges tried to argue that the person had never actually left the ship, so they never technically touched free soil. But Gama countered that the ship itself, while in that country's waters, was subject to that country's laws. He tied them in knots. He used their own legal logic against them, and he won. If this story of turning personal trauma into collective liberation inspires you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't determine their future. Help others discover that the very systems that oppress us can become the tools of our freedom. He defended marriage, the act of escaping slavery, as a defense of inherited legal norms. He argued that enslaved people had a right to flee because the system itself was illegitimate. His arguments were so solid, so well-researched, so devastating that contemporary observers said he revealed the fragility of the entire judicial system. He was showing that slavery couldn't stand up to legal scrutiny. That if you actually applied the law consistently, if you followed its own logic, slavery fell apart. Think about what he was doing. He was using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. He was taking the law, which had been used to justify slavery for centuries, and turning it against itself. He was showing that the system was built on contradictions, that it didn't make sense, that it couldn't survive honest examination. And it worked. Case after case, Gama won. He won his client's freedom. He walked into courtrooms where judges and lawyers looked down on him, where slaveholders glared at him with hatred, where his very presence was an affront to the social order. The numbers are staggering. In his autobiographical letter to Lucio de Mendonça, Gama himself estimated that he had freed more than 500 enslaved people. Modern archival research by historian Bruno Rodrigues de Lima has verified this, at least 500 people. One documented lawsuit alone freed 217 people. 217 human beings who woke up enslaved and went to bed free because of Luís Gama's legal arguments. Think about what that means. 217 people, each one with a name, a story, a family. Each one who had been living under the constant threat of violence, of being sold, of being separated from their loved ones. Each one who had been told they were property, not people. And in one case, one brilliant legal argument, Gama freed all of them. We know some of their names. The archives contain records. There was Maria, who had been enslaved for 30 years before Gama freed her. There was João, who had been separated from his wife and children when his owner sold them to different buyers. Gama reunited them by winning their freedom. There was Anna, who had been born free like Gama himself, but had been illegally enslaved as a child. Gama proved her free birth and got her freedom restored. Each case was a victory. Each person freed was a crack in the foundation of slavery. Each legal precedent made it easier for the next case. Gama wasn't just freeing individuals, he was building a legal framework for abolition. He was creating precedents that other lawyers could use. He was showing that slavery was legally indefensible. But he wasn't just working in courtrooms, he was fighting on multiple fronts. In 1864, at age 34, Gama founded an abolitionist journal called Diabo Coxo, which means the lame devil. He co-founded it with cartoonist Angelo Agostini. It was a weekly publication, 8 pages total. 4 pages of illustrations, 4 pages of text. It was the first illustrated publication in Sao Paulo province. And it was savage. Gama used satire as a weapon. He mocked slaveholders. He exposed their corruption. He made them look ridiculous. In an era when satire wasn't even respected as a literary genre, Gama wielded it like a sword. He understood something crucial. You can't just argue with evil. Sometimes you have to laugh at it. You have to strip away its dignity, its pretensions, its claims to legitimacy. The cartoons were brutal. They showed slaveholders as pigs, as demons, as grotesque caricatures. They showed the violence of slavery in stark, unflinching detail. They showed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to be Christian while enslaving human beings, and the text was just as sharp. Gama wrote with wit and fury. He called out specific slaveholders by name. He exposed their crimes. He made them objects of public ridicule. The publication only lasted a few months. The pressure from slaveholders was too intense. But it made an impact. It changed the conversation. It showed that abolitionists weren't just making moral arguments. They were willing to fight dirty. They were willing to mock and shame and expose. His poetry was the same way. His major work, Primeras Trovas Burlescas, was a collection of satirical poems. But these weren't just literary exercises. Each poem was a call to action. Each one was designed to push readers toward an abolitionist stance. They were propaganda, yes, but brilliant propaganda. They were art that served liberation. In one poem, he wrote about his own African heritage with pride. In a society that treated blackness as inferior, as shameful, Gama celebrated it. He wrote about his mother, about Africa, about the dignity and strength of African people. He was reclaiming his identity. He was refusing to accept the racist narratives of Brazilian society. In another poem, he mocked the white elite. He wrote about their pretensions, their corruption, their moral bankruptcy. He showed them as they really were, stripped of their social masks. He made them ridiculous. And ridicule is a powerful weapon. It's hard to maintain authority when people are laughing at you. Gama also worked as a public speaker. He gave anti-slavery speeches and received donations, which he used to purchase freedom for enslaved people. So he was freeing people through 3 different channels: legal arguments in court, satirical writing that changed public opinion, and direct fundraising to buy people's freedom. He was a one-man abolitionist movement. He understood that you had to fight on multiple fronts. You couldn't just win in court. You had to change hearts and minds. You had to make slavery socially unacceptable. You had to create economic pressure. You had to build a movement that attacked the system from every angle. And the slaveholders hated him for it. He received death threats constantly. His work directly affected their property, their wealth, their power. He was costing them money. He was freeing people they considered their property. He was making it harder for them to maintain the system. They wanted him dead. He lost employment because of his uncompromising stance. Conservative abolitionists, the ones who wanted gradual change and compensation for slaveholders, criticized him. They thought he was too radical, too aggressive, too uncompromising. They wanted a gentler approach. They wanted to negotiate with slaveholders, to offer them compensation, to make the transition gradual. But Gama didn't care. He demanded immediate abolition, no compensation, no gradual transition, freedom. Now he had been enslaved. He knew what it meant. He knew that every day of delay meant more suffering, more violence, more families torn apart. He wasn't interested in making slaveholders comfortable. He was interested in justice. Let's talk about what made Gama so effective. It wasn't just his intelligence, though he was brilliant. It wasn't just his legal knowledge, though he mastered it. It was his lived experience. He was the only black Brazilian intellectual of the 19th century who had personally experienced slavery. He wasn't theorizing about oppression from a distance. He had felt it. He knew what it meant to be owned. He knew the terror, the humiliation, the daily grinding dehumanization. And that gave him something no formally educated lawyer could have: moral authority. When he stood in a courtroom and argued that slavery was unjust, everyone knew he wasn't speaking abstractly. When he exposed the contradictions in the law, he was exposing the contradictions that had trapped him. When he fought for someone's freedom, he was fighting for the freedom he had barely managed to claim for himself. His arguments had a power that went beyond legal precedent. They had the power of truth, the truth of someone who had been there, who had survived, who had transformed himself from victim to liberator. Judges might not have liked him. Slaveholders might have hated him, but they couldn't dismiss him, because he spoke with the authority of experience. And he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot his mother, Luís Gama, the resistance leader who had fought with weapons and uprisings. He was carrying on her work, but in a different way. She had fought with rebellion. He fought with words, with law, with satire. But they were both fighting the same battle. They were both refusing to accept slavery as inevitable. There's something profound about that mother-son legacy. Luís Gama showed Luís that resistance was possible, that the system could be challenged. And Luís took that lesson and transformed it. He showed that there were multiple paths to liberation, that you could fight from within the system as well as from outside it. That intellect could be as powerful as rebellion. The cases he won weren't just individual victories. They were precedents. They were cracks in the foundation of slavery. Every time Gama won a case, he made it easier for the next lawyer to win the next case. He was building a legal framework for abolition, brick by brick, case by case. Other lawyers started using his arguments. Other judges started citing his precedents. He was changing the legal landscape of Brazil. And he was doing it in the face of enormous obstacles. Remember, he never got a formal law degree. He was always working as a rabula, a semi-professional. The legal establishment never fully accepted him. He was always an outsider, always fighting uphill, always having to prove himself in ways that white lawyers never did. But that outsider status also gave him freedom. He wasn't bound by the conventions of the legal profession. He wasn't worried about offending judges or maintaining respectability. He could be radical in ways that establishment lawyers couldn't. He could push boundaries, try unconventional arguments, take risks. He had nothing to lose. He'd already lost everything when his father sold him. Everything after that was a gain. And his writing reflected that same fearlessness. His satire was sharp, biting, uncompromising. He called out hypocrisy wherever he saw it. He mocked the pretensions of the elite. He exposed the moral bankruptcy of a society built on slavery. He made people uncomfortable. And that was exactly the point. In his journalism, in his poetry, in his courtroom arguments, Gama was doing the same thing. He was forcing Brazil to confront the contradiction at its heart. How could a nation claim to be civilized, to be Christian, to be modern, while enslaving human beings? How could it have laws protecting property rights while treating people as property? How could it talk about justice while denying justice to millions? These weren't abstract questions for Gama. They were personal. They were about his mother, forced to flee her home. They were about himself, sold by his own father. They were about the 500 people he freed and the thousands more he couldn't reach. Every case was personal. Every argument was rooted in his own experience of injustice. And the impact went beyond the individual cases. Gama helped establish the anti-monarchy, pro-democracy Brazilian Republican Party. He was part of the growing liberal political movement. He understood that slavery wasn't just a legal issue. It was a political issue, a social issue, a moral issue. You couldn't just change the laws. You had to change the entire system. He founded the Abolitionist Center of São Paulo. He brought together lawyers, writers, activists, formerly enslaved people. He created a movement. He showed that collective action was possible, that people working together could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. The center became a hub for abolitionist activity. It provided legal services, organized protests, published materials, raised funds. It was a model for how to build a movement. But There's a tragedy at the heart of this story. On August 24, 1882, Luís Gama died in his home in São Paulo. He was 52 years old. The cause was complications from diabetes, and he died 6 years before slavery was abolished in Brazil. 6 years! He fought his entire adult life for abolition, and he never got to see it happen. He also never saw the fall of the Brazilian monarchy, which came in 1889. Both of his great causes, abolition and democracy, were achieved after his death. He was spared from seeing the aftermath, yes, but he was also denied the victory. He never got to walk through the streets of São Paulo as a free man in a free country. He never got to see the system he'd fought against finally collapse. And yet, thousands of people participated in his funeral procession across São Paulo. Thousands, for a formerly enslaved, self-taught black lawyer who had been denied formal credentials his entire life. Thousands of people came out to honor him because they knew what he had done. They knew what he represented. He represented the possibility of transformation, the possibility that you could start with nothing, worse than nothing, start as someone else's property, and become a force that shook the foundations of society. He represented the power of education, the power of law, the power of words. He represented resistance, resilience, and refusal to accept injustice. After his death, Brazil did abolish slavery in 1888. Princess Isabel signed the law. And while many people claimed credit for abolition, while the narrative often focused on the actions of the elite, the truth is that people like Luís Gama laid the groundwork. Every case he won, every person he freed, every article he wrote, every speech he gave, they all contributed to making abolition inevitable. He showed that slavery couldn't stand up to legal scrutiny. He showed that the system was full of contradictions. He showed that enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting to be saved. They were active agents in their own liberation. They could learn, they could fight, they could win. And that changed everything. Today, Gama's name adorns public spaces throughout Brazil. Archives contain exhibitions documenting the visual identity of dozens of people he freed. Their names, their faces, their stories, they're not forgotten. And neither is he. There are schools named after him, streets named after him, monuments to his memory. Brazil has finally recognized what he did, even if it took more than a century. But here's what makes his story so powerful for us today. It's not just a historical curiosity. It's not just an inspiring tale from the past. It's a blueprint. It's a demonstration of what's possible when you refuse to accept the limitations that society places on you. Remember that question we asked at the beginning? How did someone who couldn't legally own property, who was denied education, who faced death threats, manage to outsmart the most powerful people in Brazil? How did he turn the law itself into a weapon of liberation? Here's the answer. He did it by refusing to accept the story that society told about who he was and what he could do. He did it by educating himself when education was denied. He did it by mastering the law when the law was used against him. He did it by seeing the contradictions that everyone else ignored. He did it by having the courage to stand in courtrooms and argue for justice when justice seemed impossible. But most importantly, he did it by understanding something fundamental. The systems that oppress us are made by humans. They're not natural, they're not inevitable, they're choices, and if they're choices, they can be challenged, they can be changed, they can be dismantled. Gama looked at Brazilian slavery law and saw it for what it was, a house of cards built on contradictions, and he systematically knocked it down, case by case, argument by argument, person by person. He didn't wait for someone to give him permission. He didn't wait for the system to change. He changed it himself. And he did it with 3 tools: education, law, and words. He taught himself to read. He mastered legal arguments. He wrote poetry and journalism that changed minds. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense. They were better than weapons, because they couldn't be taken away. Once he had knowledge, once he had skills, once he had the ability to argue and persuade and expose contradictions, no one could strip that from him. That's the power of intellectual resistance. That's the power of using the master's tools against the master. That's the power of transformation, and it's available to anyone willing to do the work, anyone willing to educate themselves, anyone willing to understand the systems that oppress them, anyone willing to fight. So what does this mean for you? You might not be fighting slavery, but you're fighting something. We all are. We all face systems that tell us we can't, we shouldn't, we're not qualified, we're not good enough. We all face barriers that seem insurmountable. We all have limitations placed on us by society, by institutions, by other people's expectations. Gama's story tells us that those limitations are lies. They're stories that serve the people in power. They're not truth. The truth is that you can educate yourself. You can master skills. You can understand systems well enough to challenge them. You can turn your lived experience into moral authority. You can use your outsider status as freedom to be radical. The truth is that transformation is possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. Gama's transformation from enslaved child to liberator of 500 people wasn't inevitable. It required extraordinary effort, courage, intelligence, and persistence. It required him to risk his life repeatedly. It required him to face hatred, threats, and institutional barriers every single day. But he did it. And if he could do it, starting from where he started, facing what he faced, then what's possible for you? What limitations in your own life might actually be fuel for your greatest transformation? What systems that seem unchangeable might actually be full of contradictions waiting to be exposed? Gama never got to see slavery abolished. He died 6 years too soon. But his work made abolition possible. The cases he won, the precedents he set, the minds he changed, they all contributed to the end of slavery in Brazil. He didn't need to see the victory to achieve the victory. His transformation was complete, not when slavery ended, but when he freed his first person, when he won his first case, when he proved that the system could be beaten. Because transformation isn't about the destination, it's about the journey, it's about who you become in the process of fighting. Gama transformed from victim to liberator, not when he freed 500 people, but when he freed the first one, when he stood in that courtroom and argued for justice. When he refused to accept that his enslavement defined him, that's when the transformation happened. Everything after that was just proof. So here's what I want you to take from this story. Luís Gama was born free, illegally enslaved at 10, taught himself to read at 17, escaped at 18, and spent the next 34 years of his life freeing others. He used law, poetry, journalism, and public speaking to dismantle slavery from within. He faced death threats, institutional racism, and the hatred of the powerful, and he never stopped. He carried on his mother's legacy of resistance, transforming it from armed rebellion to intellectual warfare. He showed that there are multiple paths to liberation. He showed that the systems that oppress us can become the tools of our freedom. He showed that transformation is possible against all odds. His story is a challenge. It's a question. If he could do that, starting from there, facing that, what can you do? What are you capable of that you haven't even imagined yet? What transformation is waiting for you if you're willing to fight for it? Remember, Gama started with nothing. He had every disadvantage society could create. And he still transformed himself into one of the most important figures in Brazilian history. His name is on buildings. His story is taught in schools. The people he freed, their descendants, are living free lives today because of him. That's the power of refusing to accept limitations. That's the power of education, of mastering systems, of using intellect as a weapon. That's the power of transformation, and it's available to you. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. So, what's your transformation going to be? What system are you going to challenge? What limitations are you going to refuse? Share your thoughts below. Tell me what limitation you're ready to challenge. Tell me what you learned from Gama's story. Tell me how you're going to apply this to your own life. Because that's how transformation spreads. Not just by hearing the story, but by living it. by taking the inspiration and turning it into action, by refusing to accept the limitations that society places on us. Luís Gama transformed himself from enslaved child to liberator of hundreds. He turned personal trauma into collective freedom. He used intellect to dismantle oppression, and he did it all without the advantages we think we need. He did it with education, law, and words, with courage, persistence, and refusal to accept injustice, with the understanding that systems are made by humans and can be unmade by humans, with the knowledge that transformation is always possible, even when it seems impossible. That's his gift to us. The knowledge that we can transform, that we can challenge systems, that we can free ourselves and others, that limitations are lies, that the path exists. Now walk it.